On today's episode,
I think the bond markets, listen, there's a lot of pension funds, a lot of pools of money that need to buy duration and match it with, retiring populations and forward obligations. But the truth is, I haven't met anybody who has an authoritative answer to whether we're going to be able to sell all this supply. I don't know.
welcome to the Active Share podcast that explores less obvious investing insights in a world that's always changing. I'm your host, Hugo Scott-Gall. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Rob Kaplan, former president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Rob was previously the Martin Marshall Professor of Management Practice and a Senior Associate Dean at Harvard Business School. Prior to joining Harvard, he was Vice Chairman of the Goldman Sachs Group with global responsibility for the firm's investment banking and investment management divisions. Rob has recently rejoined Goldman Sachs as Vice Chairman, advising clients across global banking and markets and assets and wealth management. Rob, welcome to the Active Share.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Can we start on the economy, the US economy? We talked before when you've said what's going on now kind of doesn't make sense. You've got the heating and the air conditioning on at the same time.
Right.
You've got tight monetary and loose fiscal.
That's right.
Do you still think the same? And do you think that's wrong?
Yeah, no, I still think the same. The difference between now and the last time you and I spoke is the tight monetary has had more months to run, and it is having an effect. For those who think monetary policy doesn't work, it works. And you're seeing it in anything interest rate sensitive. You're seeing real weakness and pain. And I know I talk to lots of businesses who are waiting to term out, and they're starting to realize they may not have the window to term out like they thought. And so, no, it's been challenging. However, to your point, what we are seeing is, in my judgment, the fiscal spigot is still pretty robust. Now, just to put it in context, in 2019, we ran a 4% of GDP deficit in the United States. That's with the Trump tax cuts, all that, ran a 4% deficit. We were at full employment also. In 2020, we ran a 15% of GDP deficit, but there's no shock there. It was to fight COVID. That was the CARES Act. The thing that might shock people, in 2021, we ran another 15% deficit. That was the American Rescue Act, except that money of $2 trillion didn't get spent in 2021. It's been spent in 21, 22, 23, and still being spent in 24, and some of it will be spent next year. And then last year, we ran, if you take out an accounting adjustment that was made at the end of the year, we ran another 7.5%. This year, so far, we're running 7.5% plus or minus. And people kind of yawn at that, but those are at full employment. Those are historically high deficits. Interest expense is on its way to $1 trillion next year, be the largest single item. So the effect it's having is the following. Goods are relatively sluggish or even weak, and goods inflation, goods are disinflating, and China overcapacity is helpful in that regard. The ground zero of the inflation issue is services, and the reason services are tricky is services depend very heavily on labor. And we've got an aging society. Almost all the labor force growth comes from immigration, and the consumer's having lots of challenges, but they're employed, okay? And so they're spending. The problem is 60 million plus or minus consumers that make 50, 55 grand a year or less can't make ends meet. And so they're making very tough choices, but they're still spending. And we're still basically at full employment. If you told somebody X number of years ago, we're gonna raise the Fed funds rate this dramatically to 5.25%, 5.5%. Any economist probably would have predicted, oh my Lord, you're going to have unemployment rate jump up. If you told them we're going to do it and be at full employment, they wouldn't be able to figure out how that's possible. Well, the reason it's possible is you're running historically large deficits. My worry is that, and for businesses and portfolio managers I talk with, this fiscal spending won't last forever. probably because it can't. It's harder to sell the 10-year, it's harder to sell the 30-year Treasury. And when that money starts to wane, then you're going to find out what's the really organic power of the U.S. economy. And I think it's confusing to figure that out right now. And I see some people at the Fed saying, oh, gee, maybe our star's just dramatically higher. It's just, well, maybe not. It's that, yeah, if you're going to have this fiscal spigot on this, yeah, it's going to raise the natural short-term rate. But when that money wanes, what's really the equilibrium interest rate? And I don't know. I don't know that it's a lot higher than what it's been.
So I guess if you were feeling more positive, more optimistic, you'd say, well, not all fiscal, it can be spending or it can be investment. And so you've got the CHIPS Act, you've got the IRA. So is this actually productive spending, i.e. investment, that actually this is going to generate a return?
So that's a great question. Some of it, yes, and some of it, I don't know. So what's an example of the part I don't know? We built over now or initiated over 20 new battery plants in the United States, spread all over the country, $4 billion a pop. 25% typically of each of those projects is Inflation Reduction Act. 3/4 is private sector. Each of them require 15 or 20,000 workers. Those batteries will be produced based on everything I've studied and people I've talked to at a price that's more than double what China makes those batteries. And so a counter move that also is happening right now is we're raising tariffs on those batteries to sort of put an umbrella over that industry. My worry is I think the history of creating industries that aren't globally competitive except for tariffs or other artificial restrictions, eventually those artificial restrictions go away, and then do you have a competitive industry anymore? The steel industry is an example in this country. Just once we unleashed global competition, boy, it just changed things, the car industry. And so I'm a little nervous, about creating these giant industries that are really, I don't know that they'll be globally competitive. I don't know that these jobs will be around 25 years from now. I think other things we're investing in, I think infrastructure, I would think it's got to be a good thing. And I hope that turns out to be productive. Now, by the way, there are two positive things that could also happen as a result of all this one as a result of this investment, and that productivity could improve. Maybe better infrastructure and AI and everything else means better productivity. That'd be great. The other thing that could happen, we could agree on legal immigration and you could have better workforce growth. That would also be great. So maybe some of this investment will help with that, with the productivity side.
Neither of the two presidential candidates, as currently stated, are advocating for a lot more immigration and going to a balanced fiscal budget. So it doesn't feel like either of those things are going to happen. It doesn't feel, neither is campaigning on, I'm going to remove this deficit. The deficit is bad news. Neither is saying we should allow more people in, not fewer. So that those things don't seem likely to happen. So ultimately,
although the numbers I look at, and I'm curious your reaction, trying to decipher why the workforce is increasing, it looks like we are getting a boost to workforce supply. It appears from immigration. The data is not very transparent on it, but it looks like, however they're coming into the United States, some X percentage of those folks are entering the workforce.
And you'd assume that's not an official policy, but it's an unofficial policy.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah.
That'd probably be fair.
Yeah. So ultimately, the bond market will, as it always does, wreak its revenge. It's almost, are you surprised that the bond market seems to be so relaxed about the level of size of the deficits, or you think it's just a timing thing and there comes a tipping point and the bond market says no mas?
So there's certain things in life where there's no textbook to try to figure it out. And I do talk to people I respect all across the board, prominent people, and ask them, listen, we're going to sell $9 trillion of treasuries this year. Are you nervous, about being able to sell treasuries in the years ahead? And the most intelligent answer I've gotten from people I talk to is they say, okay, banks aren't buying duration. I mean, they did. It didn't work out very well. Foreigners are not buying. The Fed, I don't need to tell you, is not buying. And the honest answer they give me is they don't know. So I think the bond markets, listen, there's a lot of pension funds, a lot of pools of money that need to buy duration and match it with, retiring populations and forward obligations. But the truth is, I haven't met anybody who has an authoritative answer to whether we're going to be able to sell all this supply. I don't know. I do think I'm more optimistic that the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency for longer than people fear. I don't know whether people will put their money in dollars and say, I'll buy the 3 and the 5 year, but I won't buy the 10 year and the 30 year. I don't know.
There is an argument that the seizure of Russia's basically foreign exchange assets has spooked a lot of the world, who now say, hold on, we don't want to hold dollar assets because they could be taken off us if geopolitics change. Do you buy that argument that that's structurally changed demand for dollar assets?
Well, we are doing a number of things to motivate certain foreign parties to say we'd be wise to own something, to denominate our purchases and transactions or holdings in something other than dollars, because there's a risk of using the dollar as a weapon. So there's some of that happening. And I notice gold prices, when rates go up, you think gold prices don't go up, but gold has been going up. That may be one reason why. Having said that, the thing we've got going for us in the United States is it's hard to figure another alternative other than gold or maybe other non-paper currencies. Not a lot of other great options. China's got, 20 years plus of reforms to make. And China's population is likely to go from 1.2 billion to 800 million. They've got, people don't realize how significant the challenges are for China. Do you really want to put your money in the Chinese currency? I don't know about that. So I think the United States, for all our challenges, still looks relatively pretty good. But the issue will be, I used to think the big issue facing the United States is, oh my God, people aren't going to own the dollar. And now I realize that isn't the big issue. I think they're going to own the dollar. There's an intermediate issue. They'll own the dollar, but they don't want to buy duration. That's the bigger issue. And I see the Treasury is trying to deal with this by shortening. They're doing a good job trying to tailor their auctions to where they think demand is, and they're being very careful not to have a failed, 10-year or 30-year auction. But they're doing that by reducing supply.
But the average maturity of U.S. sovereign debt is pretty short versus everyone else. Now, you can say that's the exorbitant privilege of having the world's reserve currency, but at some point that catches up with you in, as you said,
it's catching up right now.
Yeah, interest costs relative to GDP just keep going up, and that, where do you find the dollars from, particularly if you have to tighten your belt? It feels like it's not coming from defense, so it has to come from somewhere. That's problematic.
Time is not our friend right now, in that once you get to $1 trillion, which based on everything I've seen, it looks like it'll be next year. Even assuming the Fed is able to cut rates, it's going to be next year. You kind of are in a little bit of a straitjacket where your options get a lot more difficult for how do you get out of it. And my guess is there's going to be 15 things we need to do, not 1 or 2. You need legal immigration reform. You need to improve education in the United States to improve productivity. You're going to have to means test and do all this controversial stuff on Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, maybe raise taxes, all these things that are hard to do. And it may take a bipartisan commission to rationally study all this, but that has to get authorized by both parties, and it hasn't happened.
And a lot of things are going very well from a bipartisan point of view. The parties have never been closer, have they? So if inflation, so if you said a big driver of inflation is basically a change in supply of labor.
Yeah.
Now, then you talked about immigration, but ex-immigration, that's not changing. That's going to get tougher, and that's getting tougher pretty much everywhere. There's outside of Africa, there's hardly anywhere with a demographic surplus.
So in that regard, we should be glad that we've got AI and technology-enabled disruption, because if in an aging world, we grew up, there was a book called The Population Bomb. Remember that book way back when? Well, I grew up with a book. There were so many people. How are you going to find ways to employ them? Today, our problem is the opposite. We don't have enough. We'll have enough jobs, in my opinion. We may not have enough people. And the other thing is people will have to get trained and retrained several times in their career. There'll be a premium on literacy. And in those areas, I don't know that we're putting enough effort into boosting ourselves there.
If I was more optimistic, you look at the US finds a way. The US has been very good at primary innovation, ARPA, DARPA, motivated by Cold War.
Yeah.
And then monetizing that innovation, which is what Silicon Valley does brilliantly. So I wouldn't want to bet, and I don't think you're saying that, but I wouldn't want to bet against the innovation machine here.
So let me frame it differently. There's the private sector, and then there's the government sector. We've got the best private sector on the planet. And I'd say, relatively speaking, maybe even our relative advantages are even greater than they were. And so I agree with you totally. And during our lives, when there was a crisis, it was always in the private sector, and then the government would come in and help solve the private sector problem. You and I have never seen a situation where the private sector right now, it's not perfect, but it's in pretty good shape. And competitive competition and innovation. Now, you could quibble about too much regulation and all that, but boy, private sector is not in bad shape. I actually am worried about the government. So all these things I'm talking about, I'm worried about, have to do more with the government sector. And we don't have any experience in our lifetime having a government crisis where we had to address the government issue. I don't even know how to, I honestly don't even know how to think about it. You know, state government issue, then you've got other segments that can help. But the reason I'm flagging the government debt issue is that's one issue that I don't think we're going to struggle to deal with that. And if, for example, that you have to pay more, we have to pay more for the 10-year and the 30-year relative to short rates, that just means the cost of financing for every company in the country who borrows in the public markets goes up. It's something we should be. The reason I talk about this is what I'm saying is I'm confident, to your point, we can solve this, but we can't solve it if we're not even talking about it. We should be talking about it.
I hear you. In terms of productivity, I guess Japan went first on aging. If you look at Japan's productivity per working age population, actually it was pretty good. They actually did have a productivity revolution, particularly in manufacturing, not so much in services. I would have thought the US is more than capable of having some kind of productivity surge, given innovation around energy. Energy is more likely, I think, to become abundant than it is scarce. Compute power is maybe trending the same way over time. I'm not talking about the next 3-5 years. So you can see if you've got great infrastructure, which is not true now, but it maybe is changing around electrification, around provision of energy, provision of compute power, accessibility of it. Those things are pretty important ingredients to have a productivity surge. And then you put AI on top of that.
So here's the challenge for us. Our service sector as a percentage of the economy is bigger than Japan's. You know, they're more manufacturing, export-oriented economy. We're more of a consumption economy, service sector economy. So to your point, it's going to be critical to get productivity gains in the service sector. And we can do all this. But again, if you step back, way back, we're an aging society, not as bad as Japan or Germany or China, but we're an aging society that is getting more and more and more leveraged at the government level. So these things, we've got all these strengths, which you just said, except we're an aging society that's getting more and more leveraged at the government level. And we have got a system that relies very heavily on government for retirement and healthcare. And so you got to have the money. This picture needs to be addressed.
So we're going to ask more of government. Government needs to
Or better yet, we may need to ask them to do less.
Yes. Do less, but do better.
Well, let's put it this way, and this is sensitive, and I won't mention any state but let's say track. We've got bigger fiscal spending. So back to fiscal spending. And some of these projects, again, I think only the government can do. Big highway project, who else is going to do it? Big battery plant in a state that already has a 2.9% unemployment rate or 3% unemployment rate, in a world where you can import the product that plant is going to produce at a lower price. I don't know if that's a good. If you knew we're over-leveraged in an Asian society and costs are a problem, not jobs, I'm just saying maybe those trade-off decisions that are getting made up here in the government level ought to be made with that prism.
Yep. Understood. So one of the things I think that's going to be filling government in trays is the role of geopolitics, and we're seeing it now. We're seeing big tariffs being put on electric vehicles made in China. Is that good for the average American consumer?
Raises costs.
It raises costs. Like the same car now costs more than it did. How does that help me if I'm the average American consumer?
So again, and I'm no politician and I wouldn't be a good politician, but it strikes me that the historical playbook in this country, you create jobs and you create a low unemployment rate and financial markets doing pretty well, you're all set. We haven't been through a period where, again, our problem today is not that we don't have enough jobs. It's that costs are too high, particularly for the family that makes $50,000 a year or less. And so some of these policies help protect jobs, but we have, in my opinion, we have enough jobs. You got to have faith we'll have enough jobs. Our problem is the cost to make ends meet for food, rent, energy, and healthcare are too high. And, I go out, and I say this everywhere I go out and interview 25 or 50 people and who make 50 grand a year or less. And people say, that's unrealistic. No, you deal with them everywhere you go. It won't be hard. I talk to them everywhere I go. And they'll tell you the story. You only need to do 15 or 20 because you'll hear the same thing in the next 20. I can't make ends meet. I'm working 2 jobs. I'm in my late 40s. I really don't want to change jobs right now. My kids, it breaks my heart, have left high school to help us make ends meet. These are the stories I'm actually hearing out there. And they're saying, my problem is not that I don't have a job. And by the way, I have all job options. I just can't make ends meet based on what I make. And yes, I have gotten wage increases, just not enough to offset this. We have the 2008-2009 situation was an unemployment crisis. This crisis is a crisis of the employed who have jobs and have job alternatives, but can't make ends meet.
So you've got a country in the world that has a large domestic market. It has scale. It produces at scale. It's the lowest oftentimes on the cost curve. Isn't the whole point of globalization that you benefit from that they become lowest cost producer and supply the world?
Yeah.
And you supply the world and other things that either...
That's right.
So why would you want to distort that?
Trade is a strategic asset. And so, listen, when you and I were growing up, globalization was the order of the day, and you might argue that went too far. We can outsource anything. And so we lost a lot of industries, and a lot of people lost jobs. Towns lost entire industries, textiles, and the whole list. And we did a lousy job probably retraining people. And so globalization got a bad name. All right. Now the pendulum has swung, particularly post-COVID, to I would call deglobalization. Hey, why don't we make it here? Chips, why don't we make some here? I agree, we should be making semiconductors here. But we didn't make any here. Why don't we make all this stuff here? But maybe the pendulum has swung a little too far where we're sloshing into these things that, well, gee, why don't we make these things here? Well, why? And I hope the pendulum needs to swing back where, yeah, there's certain things that have got to be made here. And there's certain things where trade, if somebody's willing to give it away, maybe we should take advantage of that because costs are a problem in this country. And so I just want to see, we've gone from one extreme maybe to another, and maybe the pendulum needs to be somewhere in the middle.
The pushback against that would be, well, and you said this already, we're prepared to pay more for security.
Yeah.
And that's an easy thing to kind of say, security.
And I support it.
Yeah. But you've got to be careful about what you decide is actually security sensitive, essential, and what isn't.
Listen, if we had a war to get lithium in this country for batteries, I would understand that. But the actual battery, is the battery the strategic action? I think chips are strategic. Is the electric car itself strategic? Or is having charging infrastructure, is that strategic? Those are the kinds of questions. But, I'm not even hearing a discussion of it.
And that's probably true in Europe. And do you think maybe the Western Hemisphere has been a little bit asleep when it comes to what are the strategic resources of the future and who has control of them directly or indirectly?
We have spent, from my reckoning, the difference between us and most countries in the world are we have fiscally, in the aftermath of COVID, just had a bigger fiscal outlay, from what I can tell, than any other country I'm observing, including Europe. Nobody has spent like we spent. We have higher GDP because of it. We may have a lower unemployment rate because of it. We may have stickier inflation. We have a natural advantage on inflation in the United States. Well, I'd like to see us. We may have to be rethinking to take advantage of it. The paradigm we have right now is government does what it does. Federal government, Fed, your job, and I was at the Fed for an extended period of years. You take care of the inflation thing, okay? And so my attitude is I think you need a whole of government approach to fighting inflation. If you leave it completely to the Fed to fight inflation, they'll do it. I've no doubt the Fed will do its job. You might criticize they were maybe 20 months late, too accommodative for them, but they're in the right place now. But the cost will be higher rates for longer, and you'll have a soft landing, but it'll be the most expensive soft landing that you've ever purchased. This is a very expensive soft landing. The price tag will be paid for this soft landing for generations, I'm afraid. That's the issue.
Yeah. Wars are inflationary, either hot or cold. If we are even in a cold war, we talked about tariffs on Chinese exports. There are big fears today that China is dumping. It has huge industrial scale. It can't consume as much as it produces, so
Right.
then it dumps in global. How do you think about the realities of China was brought into the trading system and it grew very successfully, and now it's become a competitor and maybe even more a strategic competitor, and that creates potential geopolitical problems? Are we looking at structural inflation because of a Cold War? And indeed, we've got hot wars in a few places in the world.
So I'm going to set aside the politics, because the politics, as a layman watching, seem to be having a big impact on these decisions. I think we're going to have to, regarding China, and I've said this for a long time, and I lived in Asia for 5 years, and I was at China, went to China once a month for years when I lived there, and then intermittently afterwards. We're going to have to learn to realize we have to walk and chew gum at the same time with China. They're a competitor, they're a collaborator, and in some cases, they may be an adversary. All three. And I think if you put in the political, it's easier just to paint them in one of those. We've got to be able to trade with them. It's in our interest to trade with them. It is not in our interest for them to be desperate, where they got all this overcapacity and they can't sell their goods. On the other hand, there's certain things where their interests and ours are at odds. And there are other ways they could pose a threat, Taiwan and militarily and others. We have to operate on all three. And my only worry is that middle one, the collaborator part, actually could be enormously in our interests as well as theirs. Something that is good for them may not necessarily be bad for us, especially as it relates to trade. Trade is a strategic asset. And I think we're going to have to be more, I would encourage us to be balanced in thinking along those lines. Again, in a country that has aging population, indigenous workforce growth in the United States is down to 0.25%, pick it, not very high, and costs are too high. The energy transition is going to be enormously expensive. Cost of labor is likely to be sticky high because of lack of supply. Maybe we don't need to make everything here, buy some things here at lower price, and make the things here that are truly strategic, as opposed to it's got to be right to make it here and we're going to put tariffs on their goods. And of course, it's the right thing and no discussion. I don't know that I know the answer. I've learned, I was a professor for 10 years at Harvard Business School. The only thing I learned, if you're not framing the issue and debating it, I don't know the answer, but I know you're unlikely to come up with the right answer if you don't have a conversation that's balanced.
If we were having this conversation in 1982, I'd be saying Are you worried about Japan crushing the US? Japan is, it's invincible. You can't beat it. Japan is good at everything it
You
does.
better learn Japanese.
Yeah, why? Yeah, exactly. So is China the same? Is it? I mean, that was a little bit of a head fake. We had things like the Plaza Accord. Is China the same? It's got a lot of debt. It's pretty indebted. It has deteriorating demographics quite sharply.
They have a bigger military and a bigger military presence, and they have broad ambitions to compete with us around the world. But what people have to realize here is some of the things that we fear them doing, they're not doing out of strength. They're doing out of weakness. They have a terrible debt and demographic issue. They're over-leveraged, maybe worse than us. They don't have the economic dynamism we have, and they've got an aging problem far worse than we do. And so it is not in our interest to be, to bring this to a extreme head. Collaborating, or at least dialogue, is in our interest.
I want to change tack a little bit. You just mentioned you were a professor at Harvard. You were super successful at Goldman Sachs. You worked at the Fed for quite a long time. That's 3 august, impressive institutions. What have you learned about leadership, management, decision-making, either that you observed in others or in yourself, or those 3 really quite different places?
So I learned that the leadership style that worked at Goldman Sachs would get me shot at Harvard and I don't even want to think about what happened to me at the Fed. Okay. I actually think the best preparation for the Fed was being at Harvard Business School, because remember, you got a dean, you've got tenured faculty, and you can't make an academic, particularly if he or she has tenure. You can't say, I want you to do research on this. They're going to do research on what you might even be able to get them to teach a class. You have to have a participative relationship. Go to the Fed. The Fed got historic. It's siloed. It has got lots of long tenured employees who will outlast you if you're the Fed president. They know for sure if you're pushing them to do something, they know eventually you're going to be gone because your term will end. And you have to have a participative style, and you have to persuade. It is not I don't think directive is a very effective style. For example, with your research department at the Dallas Fed, you need to have a participative style. At Goldman and in business, I had compensation. I could pay a bonus. You can fire people. You can cajole people. You got promotion, and you're growing. If the firm is growing, it's a tremendous thing. It means with lots of opportunity. You go to the Fed, there's no growth. And oh, by the way, there's no paranoia because no one's going to put you out of business either. And so to get people to move and to do things, you have to change your leadership style. So that's the most significant thing I learned. And people on the outside don't realize, well, gee, why don't you just do this? Well, no, because you'll get nothing done if you tried that, say, at Harvard, or you tried it at the Fed. But each of the 3 has a different culture. A lot of the issues we're seeing in universities these days, it's interesting. People think, well, I guess the donors at the university, they're the most influential, right? No, the faculty. Is the university presidents and deans lose their jobs typically because of a vote of no confidence from the faculty. And so they don't realize this constituency analysis is different at each of those 3 also. And it helps explain why you see some of the things where, you can. It also explains why somebody goes from one to the other. And man, they were just such a great CEO. What happened? Because they didn't realize they had to adapt their leadership style. So most important, and going back to Goldman now, I think I know the firm, but I don't. And I'll have to learn again as a student the culture and adapt. And I've learned a few tricks since I left, but adapting yourself to a culture to get things done is very important. That's why presidents have such a hard time. People in Congress get so frustrated. You've got these embedded design factors where say, why don't you just tell them? That ain't going to work. Sorry.
Yeah. I've used this quote several times on this podcast. Charlie Munger, incentives drive behavior. But if your incentives are really quite different, as you just said, if tenure means that unless you do something egregiously bad, you're going to be fined for as long as you want, that's a very different set of incentives to try and change behaviors. So culture matters. I think we can agree on that. Culture is harder to
And
find.
leadership matters.
Yeah. So how do you, if you go back to Goldman Sachs, I was also at Goldman Sachs, a less storied career than yours, but culture was a big thing. It was something the firm was very proud of and emphasized, and I think was very attentive to, realizing that if the culture deteriorated, that was an existential problem. What do you think you're going to take back and you're going to observe correctly, but then you are in an almost unique position given your travels outside of the firm to take back? What is it you think you're going to sort of really focus on to make sure the culture is as strong as it needs to be?
So the one great thing about being at Harvard for 10 years, when I was at Goldman for all those years, I don't know that I had a framework, but I had instincts. And eventually, toward the end, I sort of had a little bit of a framework. And I wrote something called Questions Leaders Should Ask, and asking questions is more important than having all the answers in this. But I don't think I really even understood fully why things I did that worked, and why things I did that didn't work, why not. The nice thing at Harvard, then you have a chance to study hundreds of companies, and I'm sitting with professors who've got frameworks galore. And they're explaining to me all the time. You think, boy, that's really, and now, like 3 years after I left, now I get why I struggled in that situation. But now I get why that approach worked. And I wrote 3 books then on leadership. It took me a long time to sort of frame what I was doing. I brought that framing then to the Fed, and it really helped me understand the Fed faster and more accurate, and also helped explain to the leaders of the Fed, if you're struggling with this, here's a framework to think about why you're struggling. It'll make it easier for me to go back now to Goldman, where I have a different lens that I'm going to look at things, which is different than I didn't have those tools when I was last there. And so it's a bigger firm. It's 45,000 people. It's so much more complicated. It's whatever, plus or minus 50 billion in revenues. It's, I ran this in hindsight. I ran the investment banking division. I had 2 co-heads. I thought it was enormous. And, in the scheme of today, it's a fraction. I oversaw investment management. It's so much bigger now, but I'm not as intimidated by those things as I used to be because I have a framework, a lens to look at things, and that will help me.
And frameworks are things that you treat as your North Star. I've got a framework. I need to make sure I track back to it, or just having a framework enables you to, because Goldman's a fast-paced environment.
So there's 3 things you do as a leader, whether you know it or not. Number 1 is diagnosis. Number 2 is what are my options? And number 3, how do I want to do it? Usually we spend 80% of our time on that third thing, how. And sometimes we don't even realize it. We just jump to the how, never even bother to diagnose. What the frameworks do is help me. It would be like an architect I look at a building like this one, I understand. I don't see anything. I look at a cockpit in an airplane. It just scares me. I don't even want to see it. Like, oh my God, somebody's going to fly that. Airline pilot looks at that cockpit, understands where everything is. An architect looks at the building and says, oh, boy, they did this, and it's interesting. They made these decisions. The frameworks help you on the diagnosis. They don't help you know what to do or how to do it, but they help you a lot. And I've learned a few tricks on those things too, but it'll make it speeds me trying to understand, this looks like chaos. Here's in fact what I'm seeing.
And if this is a vague but interesting question, I hope, which is, if you had to prescribe common characteristics of some of the best cultures you've studied or been a participant in, what would they be?
So most importantly, the ideal culture for me is stop worrying so much about yourself, worry about your people, worry about your clients, worry about your community, and of faith that if I work with others, don't worry about who gets credit, that justice may not prevail at any moment in time, but over time, justice will prevail. So let's worry about how to make the firm better, my department better, my colleague better, my community better. And so I am wired in everything I've done that way. And I can already tell when I interact with people and they get with that in the first 3 minutes, this is what I'm not subtle. They get what this guy is about, that I'm about how do I add value? People get excited. People get really excited. What that turns people off is, oh, let me tell you what I need. I need this and I need that. And I'm worried about this and I'm insecure. And what about me? Nothing undermines leadership more than anybody who gives off that kind of vibe.
Yeah. I read a recent interview with Jerry Seinfeld, and the question came back to, why do you think people say no versus yes? And he said people say no because it makes them feel secure, maybe even makes them feel a bit intellectually superior. It's harder and braver to say yes, but you need to say yes. Would you agree with that?
It's hard, yeah. And so I'm partners, I run a venture philanthropy firm called Draper Richards Kaplan, and Bill Draper is a longtime renowned venture capitalist, and he's probably 96 years old now, and I've learned, but he said to me a long time ago, life goes a lot better if you learn to say yes once in a while. And I think I went for years at times in my career where I was scared. So I said no because I was scared or because I didn't trust the other person. So I went to Harvard because I listened to Bill Draper say yes. I went to the Fed, even though it seemed crazy at the time to move to Texas. I'm going back to Goldman, even though people said, why do you want to do? Sometimes life's a lot better if you learn to say yes, but it takes trust and a belief that I'm going to do my best. I may fail, but I'm going to do my best and it'll be okay.
Rob, I'm very pleased you said yes to doing this interview and coming on the podcast. I want to say thank you for coming on. It's been great. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too. Enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of The Active Share. The Active Share is available on iTunes, TuneIn, and Spotify. And if you'd like, please leave us a review. To hear additional insights from William Blair Investment Management, visit us at active.williamblair.com and follow us on Instagram at WilliamBlairIM.
This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any security or to adopt any investment strategy. Investment advice and recommendations can be provided only after careful consideration of investors' objectives, guidelines, and restrictions. The views and opinions expressed are those of the speakers as of the date of this recording, are subject to change without notice as economic and market conditions dictate, and may not reflect the views and opinions of other investment teams within William Blair Investment Management. Factual information has been obtained from sources we believe to be reliable, but its accuracy, completeness, or interpretation cannot be guaranteed. Any discussion of particular topics is not meant to be comprehensive and may be subject to change. This material may include forecasts, estimates, outlooks, projections, and other forward-looking statements. Due to a variety of factors, actual events may differ significantly from those presented. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. Any investment or strategy mentioned herein may not be suitable for every investor. References to specific companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any security. William Blair Investment Management may or may not own any securities of the companies referenced. It should not be assumed that any investment in the companies referenced was or will be profitable.